Most people read Colossians 2 and it's a surface level understanding of what he's talking about when he says food, drink, new moons, festivals, Sabbath days. Okay. He wasn't, when you look at the context, it's talking about the offering of Jesus' body on the cross. They were a shadow of things to come. See, the Messiah gets introduced in Genesis after the fall, and his work is to atone for sins, to clean up the sin problem. Okay, this is what Romans tells us was Jesus' work. Now, and so people just assume, well, Sabbath means every Sabbath. Does it really? Was the weekly Sabbath introduced as a shadow of the messianic work? No, it was introduced before the fall. This is highly significant. Why? Because if you believe Adam and Eve weren't forced to disobey, that is, they couldn't have done otherwise, for instance. And by the way, the original Calvinists did not argue that this was doing away with the weekly Sabbath either. So they would argue the same way we would because they're Sabbatarian. And then the rest of them, if you think what if they had obeyed? What if they hadn't eaten the fruit? Okay. If you believe that Adam and Eve could have not disobeyed God and eaten from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, guess what? There wouldn't have been a need to bring in the shadows of the temple services with sacrifices, which typed the sacrifice of the Messiah for sin, if they hadn't sinned. See? So the whole system of the offerings, the food and drink there is not, now you can drink pig's blood because Jesus died on the cross. Now you can eat things that eat poop for a living or poison for a living are now okay to eat because put whatever you want in your mouth. And Jesus says it's clean now. Put anything in there, anything. All food's clean. What is food exactly? I'm not sure. I guess whatever people have ever eaten is food, apparently. And then Paul, for some reason, in Acts 15, we see them telling them not to eat things strangled and blood. But all foods are clean. Somehow. Is that what that means? No. Obviously not. That would make the Bible contradict itself. So the food and drink, you can see this in Ezekiel, Hosea 2. There are added Sabbaths that were part of the things that were shadows of the ministry of Christ to deal with sin, the sin problem. The Sabbath and the 10 Commandments define sin. The part of the law that dealt with sin were shadows pointing to the messianic work of Christ, which were things added after the fall. Okay? So, and you look at it, well, it's the same word for the weekly Sabbath there in Colossians 2. Yeah, it's the same word for the word Sabbath. It's a good English translation, which the context determines the meaning. And the context is the things added that shadowed the messianic type. It's the antitype that Jesus fulfills. His body, these are offerings. There are no food and drink laws per se. There's food laws. These are food and drink offerings mentioned in the same construction in Ezekiel or Hosea 2. Ezekiel, I think it's 47. The prince will come and offer on the new moons, feasts, and Sabbaths. The offerings, the food and drink offerings, it just falls off there. Kind of like how it's funny because how people can be inconsistent. Just like Daniel 8 doesn't have the word sacrifice, but the English adds it, but everybody insists that it should be there. Well, here in Colossians, which isn't true because it actually turns the adjective into a noun with the definite article. It's about the daily. It's in an apocalyptic, or at least partly apocalyptic symbolic prophecy there. Well, here, this is not symbolic prophecy. Okay. If you think it should be there, sacrifice. And we know what he's talking about here in context regarding offerings, because that's what Jesus' body on the cross with, a body you have prepared for me. He offers it for man. Substitution, in some sense, right? Jesus willfully went to his death to present himself to God. That's why he rose on the first fruits. He died on the Passover. And the Passover represented if you had the blood of the lamb on your doorpost, the angel of death will pass over. Or the firstborn son will die. They deny that typology if you want, I suppose. But my point is, but the body is Christ. See, it's talking about offerings, the things offered to God that we no longer have to offer to God. See, the Sabbath isn't a ceremonial ritual thing. It's resting from your work, honoring God as a creator. So context determines meaning. Okay. God's not, see, the things that the carnal ordinances that were associated with the need to be able to come near to God at the temple, that's done away with. The walls of separation for the nations are to come near to God are come down. Doing away with the Sabbath would be like doing away with the blessing of coming near to God, according to the commandments introduced prior to needing messianic, what Christ would serve as a offering to God for us. See, so the problem is people don't understand the Sabbath isn't a ritual thing you do. It was made for man, not man for it. The rituals were things you had to do to come near to God. That's why this distinction in the ceremonial law is necessary. God isn't going to take away the blessing of having a day that we get to commune with God once a week to honor him as the creator from the very beginning before sin entered the world. That's absurd. It just shows you're not understanding what the scripture's teaching. And so context determines meaning. The Bible interprets the Bible. If you want to be surface level and do away with the Sabbath, God's doing away with something was defined as a sin. Now here's another obvious thing. If Paul was doing away with the Sabbath, think about this. The Great Commission was Jesus sending them to the nations, everything he taught them, including what to observe and to baptize them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost, all things I taught you. If Jesus taught that the Sabbath was done away with, which was a very important commandment all through Jewish history, and he came to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, and he's teaching to them under the law of Moses, okay? Even after Jesus died, they kept the Sabbath during his death. They wouldn't break the Sabbath. If there was ever a reason to not follow the commandment, they were trying to operate with Jesus' death. So what does that tell you? If Jesus said it's okay to not worry about honoring the Sabbath anymore, if he even suggested it, do you think they would have not followed that suggestion when they're burying their very rabbi? Of course they would have. They would have not cared about the Sabbath. Jesus even suggested that. But he didn't. He said he's Lord of the Sabbath. And they honored it even in his death while he was dying, after he died. And so when we look in Acts and we see them quibbling over circumcision, whether or not we have to be circumcised, and Paul's did away with the Sabbath, no one brings that up. It doesn't come up in the councils at Jerusalem. It's not even mentioned. No one's worried about it. Even though the disciples themselves were keeping it after Jesus' death. Does Paul have the authority? Since Jesus, this shows that Jesus didn't do away with it. Yeah, but you think Paul can just do away with a commandment? Look at the problem when they were talking about circumcision. What a problem that was. No one brings up the Sabbath that Paul's just done away with, said don't worry about it. See, that is the most absurd, unrealistic possibility that wouldn't be recorded in the New Testament along with circumcision if Paul was teaching that. We know Jesus didn't teach that, as I just showed. And I gave a contextual understanding, a basic contextual understanding of what's going on in Colossians 2. So now, if you want to be surface level and say, well, it says Sabbath. Well, Hebrews 4 said there remains a Sabbath day for the people of God. And it's the word Sabbaton. It's the word for the weekly Sabbath. There remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. Now, is that in contradiction with your interpretation of Colossians 2? If you're honest, you know something isn't right if you think Colossians 2 is just sweeping away the Sabbath. It's unrealistic. It contradicts the rest of the New Testament. And when you take that surface level reading and you think the food and drinks have to do with food and drink laws, that doesn't make any sense. In accordance with Acts 15, where Paul directly puts that people coming into the faith under do not eat things strangled. What's going on here? Your interpretation is wrong. And when you, and to do that is to lead people astray. And at this point, you ought to know that there's a reason enough to think something's wrong with your interpretation from what I've just described. Now you can pretend that's not the case. But that's dishonest.